This is Bone Chillers to disturb your dreams. Dare to join us? Click subscribe, ring the bell. But remember, we cannot guarantee your safety from the nightmares that await. Prepare to be thrilled, chilled, and filled with a sense of dread you'll find nowhere else. Welcome to the darkness. We've been waiting.
A writer seeking the truth, the Rake. My name is Daniel, and I'm a writer who has always been fascinated by the unexplained, the supernatural, the things that lurk in the dark corners of our world. For years, I've been collecting stories, myths, and legends, hoping to find that one elusive nugget of truth hidden among the fabrications. And then I heard about the Rake. The Rake was unlike anything I had ever come across. A humanoid creature with pale, almost translucent skin and hollow, soulless eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. The stories surrounding it were unsettling, to say the least. It was said to be a creature of the night, haunting desolate areas, preying on those unfortunate enough to cross its path. Some said it was a demon, others believed it to be a cursed soul, forever trapped in a state of torment. I couldn't resist the allure of the Rake. It was the ultimate challenge for someone like me, a writer seeking the truth behind the myths. So I packed my bags and left the comfort of my city apartment, heading deep into the heart of a desolate, forgotten area. The house I rented was old and decrepit, exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere. It stood on the edge of a dense, dark forest, the trees looming like ancient sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. It was the perfect setting for my investigation. The first few nights in the house were quiet, too quiet. I spent my days poring over old newspapers, interviewing locals, and searching for any hint of the Rake's presence. But the nights were different. As soon as darkness fell, a sense of unease settled over the house. I could hear strange noises, faint whispers that seemed to echo in the corners of my mind. One night, as I sat at my desk, scribbling notes and trying to make sense of the conflicting stories I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching coming from the hallway outside my room. I froze, my pen hanging in mid-air. The scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I mustered the courage to open the door and peer into the dimly lit hallway. There was nothing there, just the empty, creaking house. I told myself it was just my imagination, a result of the stories I had immersed myself in. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Over the next few days, the scratching became a nightly occurrence, each time more frenzied, more desperate. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was causing it. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The house seemed to breathe around me, its ancient timbers groaning and creaking. I followed the sound of scratching, which led me to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and the scratching was coming from inside. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight revealing a small, dusty room. And there, in the corner, hunched over like some grotesque figure from a nightmare, was the Rake.
The Vanishing Hitchhiker of Moonlit Avenue. It was a moonless night when I first encountered the enigmatic hitchhiker on Moonlit Avenue. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, and the darkness enveloped everything in its inky embrace. I had always heard whispers about the strange occurrences on this desolate stretch of road, but I had never given them much thought. That night, however, would change everything. I was driving home from a late-night shift at the hospital, my tired eyes struggling to stay open. Moonlit Avenue was the quickest way back, but it was also notorious for its unsettling reputation. People in town spoke of the ghostly hitchhiker who would appear out of nowhere and vanish just as mysteriously from the cars of unsuspecting travelers. Most dismissed it as mere legend, but something about the night felt different, foreboding. As I drove along the narrow road, I saw her. A young woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, stood by the roadside, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Her pale, bony fingers extended in a desperate plea for help. I couldn't ignore the pitiable sight, so I slowed down and pulled over. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice trembling as I rolled down the window. No response. The woman continued to stand there, her hair covering her face like a curtain of shadows. "Where do you need to go?" I persisted. Finally, she spoke, her voice a soft, haunting whisper. "Home." Her answer sent shivers down my spine, but I reasoned that she might be a lost soul in need of assistance. Without thinking, I unlocked the car doors, and she slid into the back seat with an unsettling grace. Her cold presence filled the car, sending an icy chill through the air. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I resumed driving, and for a while, there was only the eerie silence between us. I couldn't see her face in the rearview mirror, but I could feel her eyes on me, studying me intently. Unease gnawed at the edges of my mind as I wondered who this woman was and why she was out here in the dead of night. Minutes turned into hours, or so it seemed, as I continued down Moonlit Avenue. The road stretched on endlessly, the surrounding forest closing in like a living, breathing entity. My unease grew with every passing mile, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, I reached her destination, a dilapidated old house at the end of a long, winding driveway. The house was shrouded in darkness, its windows boarded up, and the garden overgrown with weeds. "Is this it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes," she replied, her whisper sending chills down my spine. I pulled up to the front of the house and turned to look at her, finally able to see her face in the dim light of the car's interior. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of life, and her skin was deathly pale. Fear gripped me as I realized that I was not dealing with a living person. This was no ordinary hitchhiker. Before I could react, she extended her bony hand and placed something in my lap. It was a tattered piece of paper, stained with what looked like blood. My heart raced as I picked it up and unfolded it. The message was scrawled in a shaky hand. "Help me find peace." I looked up, but the back seat was empty. The ghostly hitchhiker had vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness with her chilling message. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to start the car, desperate to escape the nightmare that had become all too real. As I sped away from the haunted house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become entangled in something beyond my understanding. The message haunted my thoughts, and I couldn't ignore the urgency of the plea. Who was this woman, and what had happened to her? Why had she chosen me to deliver her message? Unable to sleep, I began researching Moonlit Avenue's dark history. It didn't take long to uncover a long-forgotten tragedy. Decades ago, a young woman named Eliza had lived in that very house. She had gone missing one fateful night, leaving behind a grieving family and a mystery that had never been solved. Her restless spirit had allegedly haunted Moonlit Avenue ever since. Haunted by the encounter, I couldn't ignore the ghostly plea. I began to delve deeper into Eliza's story, trying to uncover the truth and help her find the peace she sought. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that she had been wronged, and her restless spirit needed closure. Months turned into years, and I continued my quest, uncovering long-buried secrets and piecing together the fragments of Eliza's tragic life. It wasn't easy, and the closer I got to the truth, the more I felt her presence around me, guiding me on my journey. Finally, after years of research and countless restless nights, I discovered the key to unlocking the mystery surrounding Eliza's disappearance. With trembling hands, I returned to Moonlit Avenue and stood before the dilapidated house where it had all begun. The night was as dark as the night I had first encountered her, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. With the knowledge I had gained, I conducted a séance, calling upon the spirits of the past to reveal the truth. The air grew cold, and a presence enveloped me, sending shivers down my spine. And then, as if in response to my call, Eliza's ghostly form materialized before me. Tears streamed down her face as she finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice no longer haunting but filled with gratitude. I watched as she finally found the peace she had sought for so long, her spirit slowly dissipating into the night. Moonlit Avenue was no longer haunted by the vanishing hitchhiker, and I had helped bring closure to a long-forgotten tragedy. But as I stood there, watching the ghostly figure vanish, I couldn't help but wonder if the road would ever truly be free of its eerie reputation. The memory of that fateful night would haunt me forever, a reminder of the inexplicable mysteries that lingered in the shadows of Moonlit Avenue. The shadowy figure of Maple Drive. Maple Drive had always been a quiet and picturesque street, flanked by tall oak trees and charming houses. But that all changed when the darkness descended upon it. Every night, as the clock struck midnight, a shadowy figure would emerge from the depths of Whispering Pines Cemetery, leaving a trail of fear and dread in its wake. It all began with the disappearance of Mrs. Anderson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had gone for an evening walk one fateful night, and she never returned. Her family and neighbors searched tirelessly for her, but there was no sign of Mrs. Anderson. All that remained were her abandoned knitting needles and a chilling sense that something was amiss on Maple Drive. Rumors started to circulate amongst the residents of the street. Some claimed to have heard eerie whispers in the dead of night, while others reported seeing strange, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their vision. The once tight-knit community now lived in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. The neighbors couldn't ignore the growing unease any longer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Maple Drive, a group of brave souls gathered in the living room of the Winters home. The Winters, an adventurous young couple who had recently moved to the street, had been at the forefront of the investigation into Mrs. Anderson's disappearance. As the group of neighbors sat in hushed anticipation, Mr. Winters, with his trusty flashlight in hand, spoke up. "We can't let this fear control us any longer. We need to find out what's happening at Whispering Pines Cemetery." His words were met with a mix of apprehension and determination. After a brief discussion, they decided to venture to the cemetery that very night, to confront whatever malevolent force lurked there. Under the cloak of darkness, they made their way to the cemetery's wrought iron gates, which creaked eerily as they pushed them open. The moon cast an otherworldly glow over the tombstones, creating a hauntingly beautiful, yet chilling scene. The group moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. As they approached the heart of the cemetery, they saw the figure. It was a shadowy silhouette, its form constantly shifting and wavering, as if it were made of smoke. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of incomprehensible voices that filled the night air. Mr. Winters advanced cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the figure. It had no discernible features, just an amorphous shape. The closer he got, the more the whispers coalesced into a singular, sinister chant. "For the darkness calls, and the darkness claims. Offer the blood, or suffer the flames." The group froze, terror coursing through their veins. What kind of ritualistic chant was this? And what did it mean? As they stood paralyzed, the shadowy figure began to move towards them, its form twisting and contorting. Panic set in, and they turned to flee, but the cemetery's gates slammed shut with a deafening clang. They were trapped. Desperation took hold, and they scattered, trying to find a way out. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor, stumbled upon an old, weathered tombstone that seemed to have an inscription unlike the others. It read, "Here lies Jeremiah Hawthorne, keeper of the secret." Jeremiah Hawthorne. The name sounded familiar. Mrs. Henderson remembered her grandmother's tales of a dark and troubled history surrounding the cemetery. It was said that over a century ago, a man named Jeremiah Hawthorne had practiced forbidden rituals in the cemetery, invoking unspeakable horrors. As the group huddled around the tombstone, they noticed a small, hidden compartment within it. Inside, they found a tattered journal, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and incantations. It seemed to be Jeremiah Hawthorne's personal diary, documenting his descent into madness and the dark rituals he had performed. The diary revealed that Jeremiah had made a pact with a malevolent entity known as the Shadow Keeper, promising it the souls of Maple Drive in exchange for power and immortality. The entity thrived on fear and darkness, and its influence had grown stronger with each passing generation. The group realized that they had to break this curse, and their only chance lay in thwarting the entity's insatiable hunger for fear. They knew what they had to do. With newfound determination, they returned to the shadowy figure, which had now cornered Mr. Winters. As the entity reached out with its amorphous tendrils, the group began to recite the diary's incantations in unison. The air crackled with energy as the words filled the night. "For the darkness calls, and the darkness claims. Offer the blood, or suffer the flames." But this time, the chant had changed. The entity recoiled, writhing in agony as it thrashed about, its shadowy form dissipating. The whispers turned into anguished screams, and a blinding light erupted from the cemetery. With a final, gut-wrenching shriek, the entity vanished, leaving behind only silence and darkness. The cemetery's gates swung open, and the group rushed to Mr. Winter's side, helping him to his feet. Maple Drive was no longer haunted by the shadowy figure, and the fear that had gripped the neighborhood began to dissipate. The legend of Whispering Pines Cemetery had come to an end, but the memory of their harrowing ordeal would forever haunt their dreams. As dawn broke over Maple Drive, the neighbors stood united, their spirits unbroken. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, proving that even in the face of the most terrifying legends, the power of courage and unity could conquer the deepest of fears. The legend of Whispering Pines Cemetery. It was a crisp autumn evening when 5 friends gathered around a crackling bonfire in the heart of Whispering Pines Forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, and the trees swayed gently in the fading twilight. Their faces were illuminated by the dancing flames as they spoke in hushed tones about the legendary Whispering Pines Cemetery. The cemetery was a place of dark mysteries and forbidden stories, hidden deep within the woods. It had been abandoned for decades, its gravestones crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Locals whispered tales of restless spirits and vengeful ghosts that prowled the grounds at night, seeking retribution against any intruders. As the fire crackled and popped, Mark, the boldest of the group, proposed a dare. "I heard that if you spend a night at Whispering Pines Cemetery, the spirits won't bother you. Who's up for the challenge?" His friends exchanged nervous glances. Sarah, the cautious one, voiced her concerns. "Are you sure, Mark? I mean, what if the stories are true? It's not worth risking our lives for a dare." But Jake, the troublemaker, scoffed. "Come on, Sarah, don't be such a buzzkill. It's just a bunch of spooky tales to keep kids away. Besides, we're not kids anymore. We can handle a night in an old graveyard." Mark's girlfriend, Emily, bit her lip, torn between her fear and her desire to prove herself. Jason, the quietest of the group, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, the group decided to accept the dare. They gathered their backpacks, flashlights, and a few snacks, and set off into the woods, guided by an old, weathered map that Mark had found in his grandfather's attic. The moon hung low in the sky as they entered the dense thicket of trees. The path grew increasingly overgrown, and the darkness swallowed them as they ventured deeper into the forest. Eerie sounds filled the night, the distant howl of a lone wolf, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the edge of Whispering Pines Cemetery. The moonlight revealed a scene straight out of a nightmare. Tombstones covered in moss loomed in the pale glow, their shapes distorted and grotesque. Shadows danced among the graves, and the air grew colder. Emily shivered and clutched Mark's arm. "I'm starting to think this was a bad idea," she whispered. Mark squeezed her hand reassuringly but couldn't deny the unsettling atmosphere that enveloped them. "We'll be fine. Remember, the legends say the spirits only come out at midnight. We have plenty of time to set up camp." They pitched their tents at the edge of the cemetery, their flashlight beams occasionally catching glimpses of the forgotten names on the gravestones. As the night deepened, they shared stories around the campfire, trying to keep their nerves at bay. Midnight approached, and the woods grew eerily silent. The wind whispered through the trees, and the temperature plummeted. Jason finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's time, guys. Midnight is almost here." They extinguished the campfire and huddled inside their tents, clutching their flashlights tightly. The minutes ticked away, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a faint, mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the heart of the cemetery. Sarah gasped, her grip on Emily's hand tightening. "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "I heard it. But remember, it's just the wind. We can't let our imaginations run wild. But just as Mark finished speaking, the wailing grew louder, and the ground beneath their tents began to tremble. Shadows moved among the gravestones, taking on the form of spectral figures. Jake's voice trembled as he whispered, "That's not the wind, Mark. Look." The figures drew closer, their features becoming clearer in the dim moonlight. They were the spirits of the long-forgotten souls buried in Whispering Pines Cemetery. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and they reached out with spectral hands. In a panic, the friends scrambled out of their tents and turned on their flashlights. The unearthly figures surrounded them, their mournful wails growing louder and more desperate. Mark, Emily, Sarah, Jake, and Jason stood back to back, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What do they want?" Emily cried. Jason, who had been silent all night, finally spoke. "They want revenge. They were wronged in life, and now they seek retribution against any intruders who dared to disturb their eternal rest." As the spirits closed in, Mark remembered an old folk remedy his grandfather had told him about. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small pouch filled with salt. With trembling hands, he scattered the salt in a circle around them. The spirits hissed and recoiled, unable to cross the barrier of salt. Mark's grandfather's words echoed in his mind, "Salt has the power to protect the living from the restless dead." For hours, they remained trapped within the salt circle, listening to the anguished wails of the vengeful spirits. Dawn finally broke, and the spectral figures retreated into the shadows, their thirst for revenge unquenched. Exhausted and shaken, the friends packed up their belongings and made their way out of Whispering Pines Cemetery, vowing never to return. They had survived the night, but the horrors they had witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they emerged from the woods, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, banishing the darkness and dispelling the chilling memories of their night at the legendary cemetery. But they knew that the spirits of Whispering Pines Cemetery would forever be a part of their own legends, a story to be whispered around campfires for generations to come. The haunting at Hull House. I never believed in ghosts. Not until we moved into Hull House. It was a historic suburban home in Chicago, with a history darker than its Victorian facade suggested. We were a typical suburban family, my wife Sarah, our teenage daughter Lily, and myself, Mark. We were drawn to Hull House by its grandeur, but we had no idea of the horrors that lurked within its walls. The house had stood for over a century, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, like a relic from a bygone era. The moment we stepped through the front door, I felt an eerie chill crawl down my spine. Sarah sensed it too, but we brushed it off as the natural apprehension that came with moving to a new place. The realtor had been vague about the house's history, only hinting at rumors of dark rituals that had taken place here long ago. We thought nothing of it, assuming it was just an old wives' tale. But as we settled in, strange occurrences began to happen. It started innocently enough. Objects would move on their own. I'd leave my car keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them in the living room moments later. Lily's books would inexplicably fall off her shelf, and Sarah swore she heard whispers in the dead of night. We tried to explain it away as the quirks of an old house, but the unease settled deep within us. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faintest of whispers coming from the hallway. It was a woman's voice, soft and melancholic, too distant to make out the words. I told myself it was a draft, but my heart raced as the voice seemed to draw nearer. The next morning, I mentioned it to Sarah, but she dismissed it as a dream. Lily, however, had a different story to tell. She claimed to have seen a figure in the hallway, a shadowy silhouette of a woman. She said it had beckoned her, and when she approached, it vanished into thin air. I couldn't deny that something was amiss. That evening, I decided to do some research. I visited the local library and dug into the history of Hull House. It turned out the rumors of dark rituals were not unfounded. A woman named Eleanor Hartman had lived here in the late 1800s. She was said to be a practitioner of the occult, dabbling in forbidden rituals and dark magic. Legend had it that Eleanor's powers had grown too great, and she'd attracted the attention of malevolent forces. She disappeared mysteriously one night, and the house had been plagued by strange occurrences ever since. People had claimed to see her ghostly figure in the mirrors, and objects would move as if guided by unseen hands. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Eleanor's spirit lingered in Hull House, restless and vengeful. But what did she want? And why had she chosen us? That night, the house seemed different, as if it had grown colder and more oppressive. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel an invisible presence in every room. As I lay in bed, I noticed the antique mirror on the opposite wall. Its glass seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone's throw. I watched in horror as Eleanor's ghostly figure materialized within the mirror. She was a spectral woman in a flowing black gown, her eyes empty voids of despair. Her bony fingers reached out towards me, and a piercing scream echoed in my head. I bolted upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. Sarah stirred beside me, but she hadn't seen what I had. Or at least, she didn't remember it. The next morning, I knew we had to leave. I couldn't bear the thought of Eleanor's malevolent presence any longer. But as I broached the subject with Sarah, she looked at me with glazed eyes, her voice distant and hollow. "We can't leave," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "This is our home now. Eleanor wants us here." I was terrified. My wife's words were not her own, and it was clear that Eleanor's spirit had taken hold of her. I had to save my family, but I had no idea how to confront a vengeful ghost. Desperation led me back to the library, where I discovered an old journal written by Eleanor herself. It detailed her descent into the occult and her final, desperate attempt to banish the malevolent forces that had consumed her. She had left behind instructions for a ritual, a way to confront and defeat the darkness that had plagued Hull House for generations. With trembling hands, I gathered the necessary materials and returned home. The house was in a state of chaos, with objects flying through the air and eerie whispers filling the air. I made my way to the mirror in our bedroom, the same one that had revealed Eleanor's ghostly form. I followed her instructions, lighting candles and chanting incantations, all while Sarah, or rather, the possessed version of her, watched with cold, unfeeling eyes. As the ritual reached its climax, the mirror began to ripple once more, and Eleanor's spectral form emerged. She hissed and wailed, her voice a cacophony of agony and rage. But I held my ground, reciting the incantations with unwavering resolve. The room seemed to shake, and I felt the weight of 1,000 malevolent eyes upon me. And then, with a deafening scream, Eleanor's form disintegrated, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The house grew still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a great weight had been lifted. Sarah collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She had no memory of the possession, but the darkness that had gripped her was gone. We embraced, relieved that our ordeal was finally over. Hull House would always bear the scars of its dark history, but with Eleanor's spirit banished, it was a home once more. We stayed for a time, determined to bring light back to its halls. But we could never forget the haunting at Hull House, the nightmarish encounter with the vengeful spirit that had nearly torn our family apart. And as we moved on, we knew that some stories were best left buried, their secrets hidden away in the shadows of the past.
Thank you for watching, and remember, the darkness awaits. Until our paths cross again, stay fearful and stay subscribed.